well today we're going to start talking about common sense ethics, often known as Intuitionism in philosophical circles. So when we look at W.D. Ross, for example, he's defending a version of ethical intuitionism. And the same thing is true of Jonathan Haidt, who calls his model a social intuitionist model of ethical thinking. Now, what is the key idea of intuitionism? Well, in a sense, it's revealed in the name. Our own ethical thinking really stems from certain intuitions we have. Now, what does an intuition mean exactly? Well, I think it's a slippery term. The way a lot of philosophers use it, it's an intellectual seeming. It just seems to you strongly that way. It impresses you that way, okay? And so you might think this is really just the idea that we feel that something is right, something is wrong. We have this intuition. Now, feeling, that puts it in the realm of emotion. And according to some people, this is basically the view that, in the end, ethics depends on emotion. You could also think, no, it's an intellectual thing. It's a function of reason. Just as certain things seem right, or certain things seem to follow from certain other things, you might think certain things seem morally right, morally wrong, and so on. And so you could think of it as a primarily intellectual thing. You could also have the view that it's a very complex form of perception. At one point in an Agatha Christie novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the doctor, I won't give away the ending, he plays a very important role, and it's basically his narrative. But anyway, the doctor at some point says to Hercule Poirot, look, don't pay any attention to what my sister says, it's just intuition. It's not based on reasons. And Poirot says, well, actually, what we call intuition is somebody's observation and deduction from thousands of little details that they notice. They can't even tell you what they are, but they're noticing all of this stuff, and that gets expressed as intuition. Well, whatever intuition is, whether it's really some kind of largely subconscious combination of thousands of little details, whether it's something that is inborn in us, whether it's an emotional response or whatever, the intuitionist says we have in effect this automatic set of responses, and they play a very important role. Now, there are some theses that I think go along with the intuitionist picture. And so, if we begin thinking, what is common sense ethics? It's useful to reflect both on the way in which we think about these things, and also the way we might formulate a more precise philosophical theory. The way I think of it, intuitionism and ethics is a combination of three different theses. The first thesis is that goods differ in value, that sources of ethical values are different. So you might think of this as a thesis of pluralism. Okay? There are different kinds or sources of value. The second thing is that, what? These often come into conflict. If there's one source of value, then in a sense you could say, look, there's never any real conflict, right? I mean, if there's one kind of good in the world, then we're all trading amounts of that kind of good. And so there's no real basis for conflict. The hardest thing would be when the amounts are equal. But it's as if we're talking about, money. And it's just a question of, $10 compared to $5. $10 is more. $5 is less. If you've got two quantities of $5, well, gosh, they're equal. Nothing very interesting, right? There's never any conflict. However, if we've got different kinds of things, there is a potential for conflict. And so the second thesis is one of moral conflict. Okay? There are trade-offs that we have to make. That is to say, these sources can conflict. In fact, intuitionists also say they often do conflict. So we often find ourselves in a position where there are different kinds of obligations or different kinds of goods, different kinds of bad things we have to avoid. And Sometimes we can get one good only at the expense of some others. And then the last one is complexity. Which is to say, look, the way in which we think about these goods and trading them off against each other is complicated. Okay? How big, what would it take to make you think it was morally legitimate to break a promise? How significant does this have to be? There aren't any rules for that, okay? So in short, the complexity thesis is there are no rules for making the trade-offs. For resolving these conflicts. There are no universal rules. Another way of putting it is all moral rules have exceptions. Okay? There are always exceptions. There are always things that would make you think, well, yes, do not steal. Oh, but what if you have to steal bread to feed your starving family during a blizzard? Or, do not break a promise. But what if there is some great good to be gained by breaking that promise? Do not shirk on paying a debt unless, well, gosh, something terrible is going to happen if you actually repay that money. So on and so forth. So in short, there are always going to be exceptions to moral rules. Now, the idea then is we rely on intuition. We rely on just judgment in the end. Because, look, we can kind of approximate all this by using some rules. We can't capture it fully. In the end, how do we decide what is good? How do we decide what trade-offs we have to make and how to make them? It just comes down to our own decisions, our own judgment. As Aristotle puts it at one point, the decision rests with perception. That is to say, it just seems to you that this is stronger. So let's think about a few moral conflicts that philosophers have talked about. Here's a famous one from Plato's Republic. You borrow a knife from a friend, okay, and you promise to give it back when he needs it. So the friend comes to your door and says, hey, you got that knife. Can I have it back? You're like, oh, yeah, sure, why? He said, the neighbor's dog kept me up all night, barking, bark. I'm gonna go over there, rip the heart out of that dog, show it to my neighbor, and then shove this knife up into his heart. Now, you look at your friend and you think, now what do? You say, well, I promised to give him back the knife. Here you go. Maybe you shouldn't do that, Plato says. Okay? Maybe you shouldn't give him back the knife. Or a case that Benjamin Constant famously raises for Immanuel Kant's theory. You're supposed to always tell the truth, according to Kant. But now, first of all, somebody comes to your door and says, this crazed murderer is trying to kill me. Hide me. And so you say to your friend, yeah, sure, I'll hide you. Put him in the closet. A few minutes later, another knocker. Big guy, never seen before, with a large axe. Says, hey, I'm looking for your friend Joe. You say, oh, he's in the closet. No, you're not supposed to say that, right? I mean, Constant says, surely you shouldn't tell the murderer at the door where your friend is. And yet Kant says, and actually when this objection is raised, you expect Kant to say, well, look, you might have interpreted my theory so that it means that, but no. Actually, Kant sticks to his guns. He bites the bullet. He just says, yes, you have to tell the truth. And then he comes up with, in my view, a rather implausible way out. He says, but you tell him the truth loudly so that your friend hears, so that he can get out of the state. That depends which closet he's in, right? And whether he can get to a window or something. That seems lame. All sorts of students of mine have tried to find other ways out of that dilemma, by the way. Like just shut the door in the guy's face, or refuse to answer, or pretend you don't speak his language, or suddenly feign a heart attack, or whatever. So anyway, some of you are very creative in thinking of ways out of these dilemmas. But you might think, look, no, there's just an exception here, right? And so there are other kinds of cases like that. W.D. Ross gives one. You promised to meet a friend for some trivial purpose. I don't know, maybe you're playing Pokemon Go together, okay? And there's a raid, and you say, hey, there's a Tyranitar, Great Hills Plaza. You say, yeah, I'll be there in 5 minutes. Then you're going up there, and there's an accident, okay, on the road, and there's this person on the side of the road bleeding. And you think, well, gee, I'm trained in first aid, I can stop the bleeding. But hey, I gotta be at the Pokemon Go raid. There's a T-Tar, man. And so you just leave the guy bleeding, and he dies, but you get your Tyranitar. Woo. Now, did you do the right thing? Okay, most of you some of you are saying, well, he got the Tyranitar, then maybe it's okay. If he didn't get the Tyranitar, then no, it's wrong. But you might say, look, no, you were supposed to help the guy. On the other hand, you promised to meet your friend then. Well, Ross says, come on. It was obvious you should break that promise. Now, the promise to the friend doesn't entirely go away in this situation. It's overridden by something more important. But you might still feel like, I owe my friend an apology. That type of thing. It doesn't go away in force completely, but nevertheless, you shouldn't do it. Well, the idea then is that there are always these exceptions. Well, in some ways, this is a negative thesis. So how does Ross actually begin to think about this and develop it? He says, I want to think about the reasons why we do things. Suppose you do meet your friend up there, assuming there's no accident. What was your reason? You promised to meet him, right? If you tell the truth, even when it gets you into trouble, why do you feel that obligation to tell the truth? Because you ought to tell the truth. Because you feel like it's your duty. And so in short, Ross says, I want to think about the reasons that people actually give for moral actions. And they aren't the kinds of things that other theorists we'll talk about later discuss. They aren't the kinds of things that Kant brings up. We haven't gotten to Kant yet, but when we look at his theory, it'll be something of the following form. Well, I thought about universalizing the maximum of my action, and then I realized that would contain some kind of contradiction. We don't think that, right? And the same thing with utilitarian. Well, I added up all the pleasures and pains that could be expected from this action for everybody in the world, and I concluded this was the best possible course of action among the millions available to me. That's not my reason. I say things like, I promised. Or, look, I screwed up and messed it up, and I figured I had to fix it. Or I owed that person an apology. Or I was trying to save the guy's life, etc., etc. In short, we give reasons like that. We don't give reasons in fancy philosophical theories. Okay, now, if this is right, then Ross says we have to distinguish two kinds of things. There is what we actually ought to do in a given situation. He calls that our actual duty. But then we have all sorts of informal rules and principles that do have exceptions. They're just kind of rough and ready guidelines. But they're things like keep your promises. And that tells us that, look, the fact that I promised to do something is a reason for doing it. It's a moral reason. It gives me some kind of obligation. But it is an obligation that can be overcome by something else. That is to say, he says, it creates a prima facie duty. So the distinction between a prima facie duty and an actual duty is absolutely fundamental. A prima facie duty, that's what you ought to do. Well, given some consideration, there is reason to do that kind of thing. And the way Ross defines it is that it would be your actual duty. It's what you really ought to do if there's nothing else moral that's going on, if there is no conflict. So let's say you've promised to do something, and there's no moral conflict, there's no problem, no big disadvantage or anything to doing it. Then you should do it. You should keep the promise. So a prima facie duty, if there is no conflict, becomes your actual duty. However, there might be a conflict. Maybe you've promised to do it, but hey, you witnessed this accident, and so on. I've been in that situation. I was once in a choir. I was singing Baroque music as a bass. I did it for 18 years, until I finally quit and realized, my gosh, I spent a huge amount of time doing it. I miss it in a way, but on the other hand, It's like so much time is freed up from doing it. It's hard to learn Bach and Zelensky and all these complicated people. Anyway, never mind. It's why I have such a beautiful speaking voice. Okay, I can project to the end of the hall very well because of all this singing training. Anyway, here's the idea. I was on my way to choir practice, and our choir director stressed, do not be late, do not be late. I'm tired of people being late, don't come late. So I'm walking to my car, leaving campus for the day, and I'm looking to see if it's okay to cross the street. So I look down there, and there's some cars coming, but they're quite far away. So I begin to step off the curb as one of these cars, the leader in this line, pulls over to the right. And I think they're either parking or pulling into a parking garage or lot or something. All of a sudden, they swing out, like to turn around, right in front of the car behind them. And boom, there's an accident. Okay? It was the most astounding thing I've ever witnessed. And I was right there. And it was like, wow, why did that person do that? They didn't even seem to be aware there were cars behind them. And the car behind them hit them, and there was nothing they could do. Well, I see the people get up, and they're okay. This is not like Ross's case. They're not bleeding, they're not injured. However, the person who runs into the other person is this UT student driving a Jeep. The person who gets hit, who was swinging around irrationally, is this middle-aged woman driving a big fancy car. And so I look and I think, well, surely there are other witnesses, but I look around, not really. And then I notice, well, okay, who are the police going to believe? The middle-aged woman, well-dressed in a fancy car, who got run into, or the UT student driving a Jeep, who looks kind of panicky, okay? And I thought, I gotta stay, okay? So I stayed and gave my testimony to the police and all of that. But anyway, that meant I was gonna be like half an hour late to choir practice. So how did I resolve this conflict? I stayed and acted as a witness of the accident, and then I just figured, I was told, don't be late, so I can go. This is why, by the way, as a professor, I never care if you come in late, I don't care if you leave early. It's because I'd much rather you come late or leave early than just not come at all, right? I've had some people say, like that choir director, don't be late. But if like something happens that I have to be late, that just means, okay, I won't come. And I think that stinks. Anyway, so here's the idea. In cases like that, your prima facie duty is to fulfill your obligation, to keep your promise, or to show up for practice and not be late. But on the other hand, your actual duty is overridden by something else. Now, as soon as we reflect on this, we realize there are several things that can create a gap between the prima facie duty and the actual duty. The basic idea is conflict. But actually, there are two kinds of things, at least, that we need to distinguish here. The main kind of conflict that Ross is concerned about is what philosophers have referred to as an overriding obligation or duty. That is to say, you have an obligation to show up on time or to keep your promise. But there's something else that turns out to be more important, and it overrides it. So you have one prima facie duty, but then you have another one, and it's more important. It overrides the first. Now, in that case, the one that's overridden still has some force. You don't show up when you promised to meet your friend, you owe the friend an apology, okay? Though there's a good explanation and you were right not to go, nevertheless, it has some force. But it could also be undercut by something. And then it loses force altogether. So some of the conflicts involve things that are undercutting. Just to guess what? Ordinarily that is a duty, but in this case it's not a duty. Now, it's easy to imagine situations in which promises, for example, are overridden. There's something more important. But what about cases where they're undercut? There is something that just gives the promise no force at all. And it's not that there's some other moral consideration that's more important than it. It's that rather there's some basic condition. Jonathan Dancy refers to these as enabling conditions in the promise that fails. You want to say, look, that promise doesn't count. You're under no obligation. So what would be something like that? It negates the promise because it turns out, look, that promise just doesn't apply, it has no force given that other factor. Yeah.
I had a question. So what if you make two promises with equal value? Say you like promise to meet a friend, and then you forget, and you promise to meet another friend, then you remember the earlier promise. Which promise do you keep?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so you've promised two people to do incompatible things. What do you do? Now in this case, you might say, look, they're just of equal value. One's not more important than the other. One might have been made first. Is that the one you want to do? How do you decide that kind of thing? Combine them?
I've had it a lot, like you just find something simple, like since I'm a girl, like every girl loves like yoga, so you just be like, oh, let's all go to yoga. It's easy, you don't like have to talk, so people don't go long, and you still count the social time.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, okay, good. You might get creative and say, hey, I promised to meet this friend for a drink and meet this friend to go to the movies, but I say to both friends, hey, let's all do blah, blah, blah instead. That might work. On the other hand, it's like, oh, I promised to be at your birthday party, and I promised to be at your birthday party, and that's like, hey, let's all just have a big birthday party. Like, yeah, sometimes that's not going to work, but it might work. I confess, when I was philosophy chair, I used to do something bad in this situation. Because by the end of my decade of being a chairman, I was tired of the obligations. Here, not so much due to promises like that, but due to meetings or groups I was a part of. There's some meeting, the meetings would be scheduled at the same time. So I'm supposed to be here for this committee meeting and supposed to be there for that council meeting. What do I do? Yeah, I say, I can't be at this one because I have to go to this one. I can't be at that one because I have to then I just do neither one and go home. That was awesome. That's how I got through year 10, basically, out of 10 years. But that's not morally to be recommended. That's only applicable if these are things you really don't want to do, and one more way. No great harm is done if you don't try. In fact, I think about most university committees, and I think probably no harm would be done if nobody ever showed up. So it doesn't matter. But anyway, yeah, there can be situations like that where you might say, wait, suppose someone said, really the one you did first is the one you want to do. The second one, you really ought to contact the person and say, look, I promised to be there, but I forgot about this other thing I've already committed to do. In that case, you might say, there's an undercutting. It's like that second promise doesn't apply. Sort of like getting married to the second person, right? You're already married. But then you meet this other person in some other city and you told them you were single and that was a lie. But then they say, let's get married. And you think, yeah, one's in Salt Lake City, one's in New York. This will kind of work. So you do that? I mean, there are people who do that. And you might think, yeah, the way the law treats it is, look, that second marriage is completely void, okay? You were not in a position to do it. That is undercut. Seems to me you still owe a big apology, as I say it, but anyway. So that would be a case. Are there other, but yeah, I admit, that kind of thing, sometimes these are just equal. In which case you might say, gosh, I don't know what you do. You have a duty to do this, you have a duty to do that. Neither one is really more important than the other. Neither one takes precedence. You just have this irreconcilable conflict. And in the end, if it's some minor thing, you might flip a coin or just do what you feel like doing. If it's a major thing, then it feels like a horrible dilemma. The novel and the movie Sophie's Choice is about that. This woman is there with her two children in a Nazi concentration camp. The Nazi officer essentially says, choose one of your children. The other is going to be sent in the line to the death. And you have to choose. And if you don't choose, I'll kill all three. So she chooses, but the choice destroys her life. And that's not a case where you can say, oh, it's like these two birthday parties at the same time. Darn, I'll flip a coin. It's not like, two kids, whatever, one, No, I mean, it's incredibly powerful and destructive. So sometimes when these are equal, it's no big deal, and other times it's devastating. Now, if this is right, there are other kinds of things then that can undercut something. For example, suppose I was forced into a promise. I agreed to go to your birthday party, but it's because you pulled a gun on me and said, I always invite my professors, and if they don't show up, I kill them. And then I promised to go. But later somebody says, you really ought to report that student to the police instead. Then maybe I should do that. And I'm not really, because a promise under coercion isn't a real promise. It doesn't have the same force. right? There's some kind of enabling condition that is not satisfied. Or maybe I didn't know what I was doing. You give me something in a foreign language, and you say, hey, you know, I really would like your autograph, Professor. You're a very famous professor. So would you mind signing this piece of paper? And so I signed it thinking, oh, sure, you know, it's just a piece of scrap paper. And it turns out it's a contract that's written in Czech that convinced me all sorts of things, and I can't read Czech, so I didn't know. So there are things like that that make this have no force. Well, anyway, so far, we've been dancing around the central question. If this is right, then the whole idea is, look, there are certain kinds of reasons we do accept intuitively as reasons why you have a duty to do something. So, what kinds of things do we have reasons to do from a moral point of view? Can we make a list of our prima facie duties? Another way of putting this is to say, can we make a list of basic moral principles? They'll have exceptions, but they're things that will express common sense moral rules about what to do in general. And that's another way to think about this distinction. These things are generally duties. They tend to be duties, he says. I think it's a misleading way of putting it, but the thought is, you say, I promised, so I should do it. That's a generally accepted form of inference. There can be exceptions, but nevertheless, it's generally a good move. So, let's think of it this way. What are some basic general moral rules? Yeah?
This is going to be very ambiguous, but if you're in a position to help someone in a manner that's unique, so like nobody else can help them in that way, and it's particularly urgent or dire, then you have a moral obligation to do so.
Okay, good. I should say basically help people. We're in need, right? But there are lots of conditions there. It's not like your life should be spent wandering around saying, need anything, etc. But still, yes, there's what Ross refers to as a principle of benevolence, okay, to help others in need. So let's start listing some of these. Help others. And you're right, to really spell these out more precisely, we'd have to say a lot more, but in general, we seem to have obligations of benevolence, helping other people when we can. Yeah?
When you get married, you're morally obligated to stay faithful or loyal.
Okay, good. You say, I have to stay faithful to my wife or to my husband. In this kind of situation, what's going on? You've made, you might say, a specific promise within the context of that marriage. Think about the 10 Commandments. One of them is, thou shalt not commit adultery. And so you might think, look, that's fundamental. Now, Ross doesn't list that as a basic one, even though the 10 Commandments, for example, do. And most other religions, among the 5 precepts in Hinduism or Buddhism, for example, is thou shalt not be unchaste, which includes, among other things, that sort of requirement of fidelity. By the way, when Stephen and I were editing our ethics textbook, well, a world philosophy textbook, there was a typo. Unchaste had a capital H in it. For no apparent reason, I just slipped and typed a capital H. In the last version of the text, the autocorrect that Oxford University Press supplied changed that to unshaven. So one of the basic precepts of Buddhism, according to our book, is thou shalt not be unshaven. This is completely a typo, and at the last round through the page proofs, we didn't catch it. But it's supposed to be unchaste. That's really embarrassing. Like, oh my God, no beards in Buddhism. Anyway, so now, there are going to be things like that we want to include. So, be faithful. I'm going to write it here on the side because it's not one of Ross's 7, but we're going to think in all of these cases. Now he says, my list isn't necessarily complete. On the other hand, we have to figure out what to do. Does this derive from one of the things on his list? Should we add it? Does it derive from something else? What's going on with things that are not directly on his list? Yeah?
Going along with helping others, you shouldn't harm people.
Good. Don't hurt people. Think about, actually in Buddhism and Hinduism, the very first ethical precept is non-injury. Do not injure other living beings. And it's known as ahimsa. The same thing is expressed in the Ten Commandments in rules like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Yeah.
More specifically, don't hurt people without good reason. So don't just attack people for the hell of it.
Right.
Okay, good. This too is going to require lots and lots of specific elaboration, right? Because there are lots of situations where we can encounter conflicts. So what are some situations where it's actually morally not only acceptable, but in some cases required to hurt people? Yeah.
We're at war with Hitler.
Okay, good, you're at war. And suppose you say, there's the enemy army, they start to attack. We've talked about what the person of courage does at the past. What if you say, well, I've converted to Buddhism and I'm practicing ahimsa. Can't hurt those guys. But they're gonna come kill us all. Yeah, well, then they're bad people. They will re-endure the cycle of birth and death. You and I will rise to a higher plane. You might think, dude. No, in war you actually are supposed to hurt people. Anyway, I don't mean there to make some sweeping pronouncement about Buddhism or anything, but you might think in this context, yeah, wait, there's an exception. Are there other exceptions that we often take as acceptable for hurting people? Yeah.
Like self-defense.
Self-defense, good. Somebody attacks you in the street. Do you have to just sit there and let them pummel you? Well, again, maybe, according to certain ethical systems, you do. But most of us think, no, that's an exception. You can defend yourself. Yeah.
Surgery.
Surgery, yeah. It's going to hurt, right? You go in to have your wisdom teeth removed, to take a relatively minor case, and it hurts, right? I remember they were knocking me out. And, said breathe, count to 10 or something. So I started doing that. And the last thing I hear as I'm conscious is one doctor saying to the other, whoa, this is as bad as it gets. It's like, wait, what? Take out part of my jaw, it was awful. But anyway, yeah, I mean, somebody who's performing surgery is doing it to help you, maybe even to save your life, but it's nevertheless causing you pain. Yeah.
Well, build justice and punishment and ready to hurt people.
Good, justice, punishment, okay? We punish people for committing criminal acts. And we tend to think in a lot of cases that's morally required, it's not only morally acceptable. So all of those are cases where you might think, look, yeah, there are cases where something overrides our obligation not to hurt people, or something undercuts it. It's like, yeah, don't hurt people, but in the context of this, that all goes out the window. What are some other basic moral rules? Yeah.
Keep your promises.
Keep your promises. What are some others?
Your debts. I don't know if that's the same as keep.
Pay your debts. Okay, good. That's going to be one that Ross says is really just part of this one. Pay your debts, absolutely legit, but that's just one kind of promise. However, there is a kind of debt that doesn't involve a promise. One where somebody's done you a favor, let's say, or given you a gift, and you didn't promise to do anything, but you might think, I still feel under an obligation. So he says there are obligations of gratitude. Thank people, right? Be thankful. And so we can put that in as a separate sort of thing. Sometimes we owe somebody something because we promised to repay it. Other times we feel obliged to repay it even though we didn't do anything. And that's because we should be grateful for times when people help us out. Other things. Yeah.
Don't lie.
Don't lie, yes. He doesn't list that as one of his basic ones. But that's surprising, given that that is part of the basic precepts of many world religions. It appears in a qualified form in the Ten Commandments. Don't bear false witness. That's a specific kind of lie. Notice that the Ten Commandments don't ban lying as such. Presumably there could be helpful lies, and they're not ruled out, but a damaging lie against another person, that is ruled out. Other kinds of rules.
Be fair.
Be fair. Any others? Yeah.
Something along the lines of avoid sloth.
Avoid sloth. Okay, good. Don't be lazy. Don't be a slacker. Actually, that conflicts with one of the most ancient texts we have that gives ethical advice is this instruction from ancient Egypt. And it's a father basically giving advice to his son. And he gives all sorts of advice about, look, be nice to rich people because they can bestow on you lots of favors. There's a lot of things that we don't think of as ethical advice now. But my favorite one is, do no more than is required. Be a slacker. Goof off as much as possible. I think, those ancient Egyptian dads were pretty cool. Anyway, what is it? But we tend to think, no, look, that's not a good bit of advice. Work hard, right? Where does that go? Yeah.
Improve yourself.
Yeah, exactly. The general principle here, Ross says, is improve yourself. Be the best that you can be, okay? And that's going to include things like working hard, don't be a slacker, do more than is required, or maybe this is instead saying, well, quite a bit is required. You're supposed to be working on making yourself a better person. Okay, anything else? Anything we're leaving out? You're about to send your child off to kindergarten. You think, what do I have to tell them? Or you're thinking, gosh, my little brother said, what are your rules for living? And you said, well, what? Or someone says, you are the new prophet of the age. Please, oh prophet, tell us what to do. And it's your job to come up with your 10 Commandments. Well, it's a little far-fetched. The commandments are within you. The commandments are within you. Follow your heart, my son. That's a good common sense ethics idea. Yeah.
Well, there's on the homework that definition of justice, maybe don't meddle into other things.
Don't meddle. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And one that confused you all terribly, by the way. It's interesting, there are certain things where you all agreed about what relationship model was relevant to that conception of justice. And others where you didn't agree at all, and a few where you just almost all threw up your hands and said, we agree that we have no clue. And that was one of those, I don't know what's going on here. Plato's doing your own thing, not meddling in the affairs of others. That is tough. But we'll come back to that one, because that's not on Ross's list. In fact, there's only one thing that we've left off that is on Ross's list. Help people, don't hurt them, improve yourself, be fair, be thankful, keep your promises. There's one other thing. Yeah.
There's something related to mistakes.
Exactly. He says, there are previous acts of my own that can generate obligations. One of them is making a promise, but the other is screwing up, hurting somebody else. Then I have to make amends. I have to do something to set it right. An obligation of reparation is what he puts, trying to set things right again. There are times when I screw up, I injure somebody else, I hurt their feelings, maybe I hurt their property, maybe I hurt them physically. Then I have to do something to try to make it right. Well, he said, look, I make no claim that these are comprehensive, that this is a complete list. But he says everything I've been able to think of, I can explain according to these. So let's see if that's true. Be faithful within a romantic relationship, a marriage. Is that something that we can explain here? Yeah.
I think that goes along with 2 and 3, maybe even 5.
Good. Okay. 2, 3, and 5. A lot of these are going to be combinations. So yes, you can say, first of all, keep your promises. Okay? And most people, when they get married, do promise fidelity. And the same thing within a serious relationship. Now, suppose you say, but we have an open marriage. There are people who think that. Well, okay, still, don't hurt people and be fair. And the idea would be, look, even if your spouse says, look, you're tired of me and I'm tired of you, I'll let you play around if I can too, and you in effect negate that specific promise, still, you're going to end up hurting people. You're going to end up being unfair to people. And so you might think, look, it's all going to follow from all of that. What about don't lie?
Don't hurt people.
Don't hurt people, for one thing. So that will explain things like the bearing false witness. What else?
Keep promises.
Keep promises. Exactly right. He says that's the key one. Now, a lot of promises are explicit. I say, yes, I promise that. Or I sign the dotted line saying, yes, I borrow this and I promise to pay it back, blah, blah, blah. But some are implicit, okay? So there's a kind of implicit contracting among us that I will do a variety of things as the professor, including tell you the truth. Suppose I came in here and made up a bunch of philosophers that never existed and just talked about their views. Well, this reminds me of so-and-so, the famous, West African philosopher of the 17th century who, and then I just make up some story. That would be bad, right? That would be really bad. And it would be a violation of that implicit contract. Now, nowhere did I say, I promise to tell you the truth, or at least what I perceive to be the truth, and not make up philosophers who didn't exist. However, that's something that you might think, wait, it's nevertheless violating a certain reasonable expectation that you have. So sometimes I make explicit promises, other times I make implicit promises that are basically just reasonable expectations that I will tell you the truth. By the way, there was an actual prominent West African philosopher of the 17th century. And it's a very sad story, in a way. He was recognized by someone who was a missionary in Africa, was immensely impressed with his abilities, brought him back to Germany, where he was educated, and became a German professor. He wrote a dissertation, which I have a copy of upstairs, called The Apatheia of the Human Mind. And it was a kind of critique of Descartes. It's very good. And he worked as a professor in Germany, and there's statues to him in Germany, in fact. But he found the pressure of adjusting to a different culture and a different set of expectations and so on so great that in the end he moved back to Africa and became a hermit. A colleague of his, years later, went to Africa to find him, and finally found him in this small village where he was living in sort of isolation as the village wise man. But he really wanted to know nothing to do with his former life. So it's a very weird and moving story. And the book is really quite good. I mean, it's a dissertation. It reads like a dissertation, but it's extremely good. Anyway, so we look at this and we say, well, okay, yeah, don't lie. That seems to be, Ross says, anyway, an implicit promise. What about don't meddle in other people's affairs?
Be fair and don't reveal.
Oh, say it again?
Be fair and don't reveal.
Yeah, be fair. That's how Plato views it. And also, don't hurt people. Now, if I meddle in your affairs, I might be doing it to try to help you. But how do you feel about somebody who's constantly giving you unwanted advice? Do you say, oh, that's very helpful, thank you? I mean, sometimes you do it. Mostly it's like, no, that's really annoying, right? And so hurt people doesn't necessarily mean kill, injure, steal from, and so on. Sometimes it's just annoy, and that's enough. I shouldn't annoy people. So, you could say to your child about to go to kindergarten, look, don't bother people. Don't keep your hands to yourself, okay? And that's one of those kinds of, don't hurt people, even if it's a mild kind of thing. Yeah.
Couldn't that go even beyond just an annoyance? Like, if you left them to take care of it themselves, it would have been even not ideal, but still much better than someone else getting involved, making it a lot worse.
Yes, absolutely right. So that's part of the problem. When you meddle, you don't know nearly as much about the situation typically as the person who's actually in it. And so you're more likely to give them incorrect advice than correct advice. Now, there are a few things I wanted to bring up that we got to right at the end of last time. So these are things that are identified by researchers in positive psychology as important virtues in the context of organizations. And if we look at those, we can think, well, each virtue can correspond in a way to one of these rules, like gratitude. Well, be grateful. Or being faithful, keeping one's promises, or, being helpful, benevolent, having a certain kind of wisdom and drive to improve yourself, being just. So what about some of those? There are particular strengths of character that are thought to be especially important in organizations. Gosh, here's the list. Gratitude. Well, we've got that covered, right? Be thankful. Express gratitude. Secondly, hope. We said hope was really, really important. Not only to work performance, but to just life success and happiness. Being hopeful. Do we have anything like that? Yeah, it's a little tricky, right? I mean, improve yourself, maybe. If I say, look, be hopeful, be optimistic. And indeed, when many of you were listing features you want in a friend, being optimistic, being hopeful, being positive was a major thing. And being negative, being critical all the time, that was a significant negative thing. So it seems like that is important. Maybe it is under improve yourself. Maybe it's part of a general attitude of gratitude. That like, it's good to be alive. Okay, zest. Just having energy. Okay? Be zestful. I don't know how to actually put that in terms of a rule exactly, but come on, wake up. Have energy, right? Don't be slothful. Okay? So maybe that's part of improve yourself too. And then curiosity. What about the intellectual virtues? Be curious. Well, that sounds like improve yourself too, right? Love. Be loving. Care about them.
Be thankful.
Ooh, it could be thankful. Might be help others.
Keep promises.
Keep promises. Yeah, they all involve some kind of concern for others. Yeah.
Could you argue that like love is actually like part of improve yourself based on like philosophical egoism and stuff, and like love, like that it's like the most selfish thing, but it's like a good form of selfishness? I don't know, I just yeah.
Well, okay, good. Yeah. There is a connection, right, between improving yourself and improving your relations to other people. You might think, yeah, I don't know how to separate what I'm doing for someone else in caring for them and what I'm doing for myself in caring for them. You might think, I hope making their life better, but at the same time I'm making my life better. At least assuming that my love takes a good, positive form, and it's not like some creepy soccer love. It's something that you might say, look, it's kind of like the two people involved are going to benefit from this mutual caring relationship. So, and it doesn't have to be a romantic love here. We can think in terms of friendship or other kinds of concern. That's something that seems important.